We're going to talk about a topic tonight, and the word is Yugas. And this is a Sanskrit word, and it simply means ages, planetary ages. Okay? And I'm going to talk about a lot of ideas that are not entirely, not of my own invention, but are the tradition brought down by Yogananda through Autobiography of a Yogi and through his guru's teaching, Sri Yukteswar, and it's a book called The Holy Science. I'll just write it up here. There's a few places where this is now being talked about. This is a book called The Holy Science. There's also a very good book called The Yugas. It's, you can find it through Amazon. It's written by, the author is Selby, two authors, and Steinmetz. I didn't bring any copies with me because we ordered our books from India and it's only published in America. But I can see that it's very much available. So I'm going to give you a broad picture, and then I'll send you especially to that book called The Yugas for more details. All of us who are thoughtful at all at this time are conscious of the fact that everything on this planet is changing extremely quickly. And certain aspects of it seem very, very beneficial. Even, our presence here at this time. I got on a plane in San Francisco. We had dinner, we had a movie, we had a nap, we had breakfast, and I got off in Auckland. And it was just as simple as that. I mean, not but 100 years ago, such a journey in such a moment would have just been impossible. And a couple of 100 years ago, no one would have even known that there was a place to travel to. What to speak of being able to just have dinner in one place and breakfast in the other, just effortlessly. The time has dissolved, the space has dissolved, and there's just this ability instantaneously to be wherever we want to be with just a few little technical pushes. That which used to be insurmountable is no longer insurmountable. Now, the Theosophical Society was ahead of its time, or I should say a leader in its time, to propose this simple idea that we should have a society in which there was no discrimination of race, religion, sexuality, creed, everything. It's that there was a perception which was radical in its time, or as I say, ahead of its time, to begin to perceive that even though there are these apparent differences between us, that those differences do not really define us. And it wasn't so very long ago with anyone in a different language, different way of approaching life, a different diet, different color skin. All of those things were considered absolutely insurmountable barriers. We are clearly separate, was the philosophy, and of course my way is right. That was the way people would think about those things at all times. It would never be a question of unity, was out of the question, especially in matters of religion. The other reality that is so interesting about our society now is I've traveled a modest amount. I am not an adventure traveler. I've never been one who just goes way off the beaten path and looks for places that no one has ever visited. But in the travel that I've done in the last, I started traveling in the early 80s, it's like the world also in its reality has become simply one place. What's happening now is that we are moving in to this time where we're having a shared global experience. And certainly the internet is making that just immediately possible. You post a picture on Facebook today and minutes later, people all over the world are watching it. Even literally, as I'm giving this talk here, Brian is filming it, and within a day or two, it's going to be posted on the internet, and the 40 or 30 of you sitting in here are watching it, but within another week, there'll be 100 or 200 or 300 more from all over the planet who will be having this experience with us. Now, if what we're sharing is positive and uplifting, the positive potential of this is enormous, because we can all come together universally as a society of high ideals. The principles I follow is the path of self-realization, is how we call it, which is just a generic phrase. We don't own it. That's what we call it, where we realize the higher and the deeper potential of our own nature. I was in India in the living room with some friends, and there were about 4 or 5 countries, European countries. I think there was a couple of Russians in the room, several Indians, American. And we were all sitting there together, and it was just after one of the conflicts started. I believe it was when America was getting involved in the Yugoslavian conflict. Americans get involved in a lot of conflicts, so we were getting involved in that one. My friend in Delhi that we were visiting had a position in the airport in New Delhi where he was responsible for the safety of all the planes. No plane could go into the air until he had certified that it was safe. And somehow during that cycle of time, he was up in an airplane, and he was on a flight pattern that was either just above or just below where the, I believe it was mostly American, military planes were flying, and they were crossing like this, and he was watching the bombers go up, go and bomb whatever they were bombing, and then go back to reload like this, and he was in between it. And we're sitting there in this living room, all these different nations represented. All of us were just sitting there, and the last thing we could imagine was being in conflict with each other. And we made a decision at that time that we're going to invent someday the nation of self-realization. And we're going to get passports so that our citizenship and our definition of who we are in the world won't be dependent on where we were born in the culture that we were in, but in who we are really in our consciousness. And that idea, in a very real sense, defines, I believe, and Yogananda and others have emphasized, defines what's really happening on our planet right now. We are definitely in a transition, and that transition is of 2 kinds. Mostly in society, what we find is that, as Swami Kriyananda put it, he said that the society is usually divided up sort of like a cigar, and most people kind of hang out in the middle. You don't really have to have strong moral position about anything. A few people are very good. You have the very serious Mahatmas and saints on this side, and a few people are very evil, and most people just live their lives without much concern. What seems to be happening now is the shape of society is turning more into a dumbbell, which is it's getting very thin in the middle, and it's becoming more and more necessary to have a position. You know, the strength of people's energy toward destruction is becoming very intense, and it's necessary for those who oppose that way of thinking also to become more deeply, at least inwardly, committed to the ideals that matter. You know, it's happening in the ecological field, it's happening economically, it's certainly happening militarily. You know, right now, I don't keep up with the news on a daily basis because I find that it upsets my peace of mind too much, and there's not much I can do about it anyway. I feel insofar as I can contribute the antidote to all that I see in the news that makes me nervous, I am doing that. I consider myself to be intensely politically active because I feel that the problems that we're facing now are problems of consciousness and values. And the more I can help people to understand the necessity primarily to meditate, to understand who we are on the level in which all things resolve into harmony, and develop in people the will toward righteousness and the will toward goodness, that I think that is the higher solution of the political issues we're facing. But I understand that we have in the Mideast now, somebody always tells me, and you can't help but know, it's like in the atmosphere. In the Mideast right now we have, you know, this extraordinarily unwholesome, you know, development that's happening now, where people are just disregarding all the normal principles of human decency, really. It's not, to my mind, a break from the direction we've been going in for a long time. You know, there's been an ever-increasing, your country is isolated, as of course you well know, and that gives you a certain amount of freedom, but no part of the world is truly separate from any other part right now. But there has been this increasing disregard of other people's welfare, of the natural world, of economic fairness. I mean, you've managed wonderfully to hold your integrity more than perhaps my country is doing right now. But what we're seeing is once you begin to disregard the rights and the needs and the values of other people, how far can that go? And we're beginning to see just how far that can go. Now, all of that I am describing right now are planetary circumstances. I mean, it's the condition of planet Earth at this time. And there's this strange thing that goes on in society, which until I became deeply involved in the principles of self-realization, I could never understand. Ask everybody, do we want to send our sons to war? Do we want our lives to be disrupted? Do we think it's really worth, killing our young people to achieve this and achieve that? And everybody says no, and yet time after time, there we go. And we can have, vast numbers of individuals who have one idea of what should happen, and yet there seems to be literally forces that are moving us in ways that I don't know, it's hard to imagine where they come from. And yet here we are, we're living in it. Now, when we were advertising and explaining this class, we talked about two different realities that we were going to talk about. We talked about the word karma, which is a word that everybody seems to know these days, which simply means cause and effect. Karma is forces that get set in motion that have to do with human life, but it's really a cause and effect relationship. If you're very mean to the people around you, they're not likely to want to be in your company. We're watching cause and effect at work there. If you're a very untrustworthy person, people are going to find ways not to have to trust you. We see cause and effect in human life in very blatant ways. The principle of karma, however, goes a lot deeper than that. And that's a part, we can explore that a little bit more, but that's part of what we're talking about. But what also happens is that a planet itself let me start back up a little bit. In human life, there are two dramas that are happening simultaneously. One of them is the journey of the individual soul. Soul is the English word we use. I don't like to use a lot of Sanskrit, but the simple word jiva is a very nice word because jiva means that individual spark of spirit that continues from incarnation to incarnation to incarnation. It's separate from the personality, the gender, the physical body that we're identified with for this lifetime. Actually, that word is the ego, is the jiva, the infinite, identified with the temporary reality it's living in. And that's not egotism or egotistical, that's just the definition of ego. That the jiva, who has lived in many bodies over many incarnations, in many ages, on many planets, Yogananda says. When he was asked, do we always reincarnate on Earth? He said, oh no. The universe is teeming with life and there's many planets that we can go to. And so the jiva alternates between the astral, the energy world, and the physical world. And it takes incarnation time after time as it gradually works out its personal karma. And the personal karma of the jiva is this process. I'm presenting these things to you because this is the philosophy I came to share. We can discuss it all later, in a moment, I mean. The jiva it goes through this process of learning to overcome its ego, to transcend ego, which is to say, to cease to identify with the temporary, and even while engaged in physical life, always to remember its connection to the infinite. And connection to the infinite. Okay? All of All of spiritual practice, all of spiritual philosophy, meditation, prayer, religion, everything is all an effort on the part of the individual consciousness to transcend its identification with the limited and to identify at all times with the infinite. Our karma is whatever keeps us identified with the limited and not identified with the infinite. And we live through incarnation after incarnation as a learning opportunity to test our attachments, our awareness, our identification, our ability to hold to our inner awareness and not be confused and distracted by the myriad experiences that happen in the course of a lifetime. All those things that make us feel we are isolated, we are afraid, we are vulnerable, we are powerless. These are all mistakes that the jiva makes when it identifies with the limited instead of identified with the unlimited. So our individual karma, because we have so many choices about where we can incarnate, we pick times and places and planets that in one way or another will facilitate our opportunity to learn. Now, it doesn't necessarily facilitate our opportunity to coast along and have a really good time. We tend to think if something is easy and pleasurable, it's good. And if it's challenging and painful, then it's bad. But that's just from the point of view of the ego wanting an easy ride. From the point of view of actually working out karma, if we have to face something that gives us the opportunity to greatly expand our understanding, from that perspective, it would be good, even if it's difficult. And to just have no challenges and no opportunity to grow wouldn't necessarily be good at all. Now, all of these different vibrations exist in human life. New Zealand has a particular vibration, America has a vibration, Germany has a particular energy, Italy, India. And all of these realities hold a certain state of consciousness, so to speak. And I was raised in the Jewish faith, and there is a tradition in Judaism, which I personally don't accept, but they have the tradition that you have a Jewish soul and that you're always Jewish. I don't believe that that's true. I believe being a Jewish person has particular characteristics. There's a particular attitude that goes with being Jewish, just as there's a cultural attitude that goes with being Indian. Germans have a particular attitude. There's a spiritual practice that we have, which is about energization exercises, we call them. It's a way to energize the physical body, and it involves creating tension in your muscles and then releasing that tension. Swami Kriyananda remarked, in most countries you say to tense your muscles as hard as you can tense them, but not in Germany. He said you have to be very careful because the willpower of the Germans is so great that they can actually injure themselves with their willpower. Well, when the jiva is looking for a place to incarnate, it needs to go somewhere where the cultural and social conditions will facilitate the working out of its karma. So if it needs to develop willpower or be in an atmosphere of willpower, it'll become a German. And if it needs to be in a more easygoing culture where things are not so tough, maybe you'll become a Hawaiian, or you'll go to some place where the manana spirit exists. I know someone said, the spirit of always doing it tomorrow. Someone asked an Irishman if there was an equivalent, a Mexican asked an Irishman, if there was an equivalent concept to manana in Ireland. The Irishman thought for a moment, and he said, nothing that implies that sense of urgency. So every place, plus every planet also exists in a certain state of awareness, a certain height or depth of overall consciousness. We're living in a time, and then this is where I'll start talking about the yugas in just a moment. Every planet has also a certain vibration. It can be a planet where a lot of wars take place. It can be a planet where it's going through a very, very peaceful time. We're living in a time of somewhat tenuous security because we're, as I'll explain in a moment, this particular yuga is a time when technology is rapidly advancing, but moral development is a little behind. So this is a time when we're developing greater and greater capacities to blow ourselves to bits as a whole planet, but we're not simultaneously developing the moral character not to do that. Or at least at the very worst, it's kind of neck and neck right now is what we're looking at. And we don't really quite know which way it's going to go. Now, as individual jivas, we apparently decided, and I have an expression that I often use about karma, which is when you do something that really, really seems like, what could I have been thinking? I always say, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Because if it hadn't, we wouldn't have done it. It did seem like a good idea, so I did it. Now I can see it wasn't. I think about incarnating it right now at this time on the planet, especially when we see so much getting stirred up that we don't know where it's going to go. It must have been, it seemed like a good idea at the time that we would choose this. Now, once we incarnate on a particular planet, even once a free soul like Yogananda or any of the other great masters, they incarnate entirely to help others. We come because we have karma of our own. This is the meaning of Jesus saying he was born without sin. He was born without karma. There was no ignorance in him. He came only to help. So even a master who has no karma of his own, once he takes a physical body on this planet, then the planetary karma becomes a defining factor in his life. Yogananda had to live through 3 world wars, and all of that turbulence, not merely the war itself, but all of the magnetic confusion that was generated by that, is all part of what he has to work with. And every master's consciousness and teaching is exactly the same, but their ability to express it is defined and limited by the karma of the planet and the karma of the culture that they particularly are incarnated in, and also the karma of the individual disciples that they come to help. And they can only advance human understanding to the extent that the whole planetary reality allows them to move. It's very interesting, just a very small progression. Jesus came as an avatar, a particular messenger to the Jewish people. At the time that he incarnated, the Judaism, which is a great and a true religion, was essentially in the hands of a very corrupt priesthood. And the concept they had of the infinite was of a judge, and that judge was very harsh. And if you broke any one of their multitudinous of rules, then that judge would be displeased and you would be out. And the arbiters of whether that judge, the divine judge, was pleased or not, was the priesthood. And so the money and all of this. Jesus came and he advanced their understanding to the point of being the Son of the Father. And he could take it from being the judge to the Father. And if you ask of your father a loaf of bread, will he give you a stone? He was trying to get people to overcome their fear of a greater reality and to at least see themselves in intimate relationship to it. But the Father is still a demanding figure. But that was as far as the culture allowed him to move it. He referred to the Comforter, but still his concept was of the Father. When Yogananda incarnated in the 1900s, his message, he spoke of the greater reality as being the mother. And this isn't really so much about men and women at all. It's just the feminine expression of that greater reality is intimate and all-forgiving and unconditional in its love. And so he was able to move in the West, just a little bit from the father to the mother. We'd gone from the judge to the father and the father to the mother. It wasn't that Jesus didn't know that. It was just now the karma of the planet allowed a completely different understanding. This whole movement of theosophy, the karma of the planet was ready, at least for the first wedge of that to come. Does that make sense? Okay. Do we have any questions about what I've said so far before I put some charts on the board? Any questions or thoughts? The question was how closely the planetary karma relates to an individual's karma. That is entirely dependent on how independent the individual is in their own magnetic self-definition. You know, some people are completely the passive result of the world in which they grew up. I remember when I was 18 years old, a woman in the office where I worked was getting married. I've always been quite a nonconformist. That's one of the characteristics of being in the Jewish culture, and that's one of the reasons I chose it. And she was getting married, and everything about her wedding came out of magazines. And I was shocked, is the only word I can use, because it seemed to me like a wedding and a marriage was an intensely personal thing, but she was taking all of her instruction and value out of magazines. And it never crossed her mind that she should make that individual and generated from inside herself. She took it completely from outside of herself. So just even thinking, because karma is a field of energy. So if the field of mass energy, planetary or otherwise, has a force field like this, and the individual has even less, then the force field of the mass karma is going to take them. If an individual has been developing an independent conviction and relationship with their own life and with the world around them, then their force could be stronger. And for example, well, here's an example that people often think of. Well, there was a man, a judge, a lawyer in Japan. This was not recent, but he was delivering his summation argument in court when he was suddenly just gripped with this impossible cough that he couldn't shake. And it was so bad he had to walk outside and to try to clear his throat. He stepped out of the building and there was a landslide and the building was crushed. But something took him outside. A friend of ours, her mother was going to come to California from the Midwest, the middle of the country, to visit her on a particular day. The girl called up her mother just a day or two ahead and said, "Mom, you know, I just don't think I'm in a position to have you visit now." Mother was very annoyed, but the girl just felt her mother couldn't come. She canceled her ticket. That plane went down and everyone on it was killed. Like, where does that come from? Yogananda made the interesting statement that when there is a disaster, like a plane crash or a building collapse or something, that it's not always, he puts this paradoxically, it's not always everyone's karma to die, but some people may have not had enough karma to live to escape that force. So the practical result of all of that is the extremely important necessity to always make sure that your life and its decisions are generated from your own connection to a higher reality rather than a passive drifting in the world in which you live. Because then you will be simply locking yourself into whatever's going to go on around you instead of being able to powerfully follow your own destiny. And so the balance is entirely magnetic. It's how powerful your personal destiny is how powerfully you are participating in your own life, or how passive you are in your own life. It's a good question. Any other questions? Okay. Most of the time, and I want to go to the planetary side for a moment. I was doing the personal side. So the personal karma is the primary karma, but then we act it out on the backdrop of the planet. I said personal is the primary karma, and then we act it out against whatever is going on the planet. And the Yuga cycle is an ancient tradition from India that actually exists in many other cultures. I can't make the case as convincingly as it's made in the book I referred you to, so I will just give you the summation of it, and we can discuss it to that extent. We tend to think of civilization as having been really primitive, really dark. You know, they were just out there with clubs and spears. The men were dragging the women around by their hair. We were grunting, we were tearing the meat apart with our hands like that. And then gradually we got better and better and better, and now we have the internet. Okay? Internet. Okay? From the internet to the cave. And most of anthropology and history just tries to make sense of things on this basis. Okay, many, many ancient cultures, including the Indian system, which is what I'm talking about, don't think of progress as being just like this. I find this chilling, because if this is the apex, God help us. Joseph Campbell, who did the beautiful stories about traditional myths from all over the world, and how all those beautiful mythological stories help shape the culture, and how dynamic that would be. He was asked, what happens, and this was a question asked in America, so I'll just take it as an American. He said, what happens to a culture when it loses track with its own stories? And he just pointed out the window and said, this alienation from the natural world, this alienation from one another. So this is not much of an apex here, is it? I hope we can do better. The traditional cultures, including the Indian, instead of it just going from here to here and then presumably upward until we either blow ourselves to bits or God knows what, their tradition is that evolution on a planet is a circle, and that we have the apex of civilization and we have the nadir of civilization. And if you read the Greeks and various others, this tends to be divided up into four. You have the gold, you have the silver, you have the bronze, you have the iron, you have the age of gods, demigods, heroes, and mortals. There's a marvelous unity among all the different traditions that puts it into four. The Indians talk about righteousness being a bull with 4 legs, and in the highest ages the bull stands on 4 legs, and then it stands on 3, then on 2, then on 1, and then it topples over. The American Indians have exactly the same myth. It's a white buffalo, and it stands on 4 legs on the highest, and then it says it loses a hair every year and a leg every age. Exactly the same story. Now, the Indian system of the Yugas, which is what Sri Yukteswar and Yogananda present, speak of this as a 24,000-year cycle. Okay, the problem is, of course, none of us, live through the whole thing, and that we have the nadir at 12,000, on either side, and it's 12,000 years of gradually ascending consciousness, and then 12,000 years of descending consciousness. Now, just for the sake of understanding this, the nadir of the cycle that we're in now was considered to be 500 AD. And the 4 ages that are included in this cycle, Kali Yuga, which is the age of matter, Dwapara Yuga, which simply means the second, is the age of energy. Treta Yuga, which also means the third, is the age of mental power. And Satya Yuga is the age of spiritual power. And the way the system works is we transition. We have an upward cycle of Kali that leads into an upward cycle of Dwapara, which leads to an upward cycle of Treta, which again leads to an upward cycle of Satya. So we crest, and then we decline again. Now, myths about the age of Atlantis, for example, which was so highly evolved, but then something happened, and the whole culture went down into the sea. The age of Atlantis was right about in here. And it crested, and then it began to decline. And when it began to decline, it began to lose, it still had power, but it began to lose moral focus. And then each of these transition points are times when there is both turbulence and enormous change. Now, Kali Yuga, the nice thing here is that the darker ages are shorter. 2400, 3600, and 4800. This is all, and I'll explain to you in a minute why this is all so exact. And then there are transition periods of 100, 200, 300 years. Kali ended officially, the transition period started at 1700, Dwapara started officially at 1900. Now, that's just, here's the dogma in front of you. But here's where it gets, really interesting. Right at this time, as history has it, all of civilization was really wiped out. This is when the barbarians reigned, and all the libraries were burned, and all of the history of these higher ages was just destroyed because the age was so dark and all of that began to be forgotten. 1700 is when steam power and all the machinery and everything of our culture just began. And starting in 1900 is when the whole revolution that we're living in really happened. Before 1900, if you really think about it, most of what we have just wasn't there. Airplanes, trains, cars, telephones, electrical systems, what to speak of the incredible accelerating of technology. Because what happens in the age of Dwapara is that we began to understand energy as a power. What happened in 1905? Einstein declared that matter itself, which had been the definition of Kali Yuga, wasn't even really there. That matter was actually a manifestation of energy. And now what people are just beginning to say, because we're just starting in this, when we get up to Treta Yuga, we begin to understand the power of the mind. Right now, as I was saying, I can go on Skype and I can communicate directly with my husband, even though in space he's very far away from me. We're dissolving space now with technology. But we have, individuals and also sort of an almost intuition that we know we can also dissolve space with the power of the mind, but our society has not yet reached that point. But the planet will reach that point as this evolutionary process keeps happening. Now, what we also have to understand about this, which is so interesting, is that this is actually a physical phenomenon. This is how Sri Yukteswar explains it. That our entire solar system, I tell you this because it's fascinating to contemplate, and you can decide, whether you appreciate it or not. I've studied this for a long time and applied it to the experiences that I can verify, and it makes sense for me. Our solar system has a dual, is how it's explained. And our solar system and that dual are in an orbit, that they're held together in an orbit like this. Like so many things that we see, astronomically in the world, there are all these orbits that are held together. Everything is in relationship. So our solar system is in a relationship that keeps us in an elliptical orbit like this, that moves us closer and further away from the energy source of the whole galaxy. You see? The energy source of the galaxy, the grand central sun is how it's called in the mythological way of saying it. So the closer our solar system and Earth get to that central source of power, the more enlightened this planet is. And the farther we get away from it, the less enlightened this planet is. And so there are planets all over creation that are at different stages depending where they are in relation to the source. So our solar system is now moving, and our dual presumably is in a corresponding decline as we're in a corresponding rise. And there is certain astronomical evidence, and they talk about it, of how they see something. They're calling it now a 25,000-year cycle, but they realize there is this seeming shift. And these are scientific facts that are all contained in the Yugas book that I explain. So we're moving closer and closer, and there's more and more energy on this planet. And as there's more and more energy, there's more life force, people are getting bigger, food is nutritious, people are living longer, and it's occurring to us to notice things that were always there. It wasn't as if electricity wasn't a possibility, or that Einstein's perception wasn't possible before, but the vibration of the planet just didn't allow us to think that way. We thought in terms of physical matter being acted upon by other physical forces. And starting about now, everybody started noticing. We call it inventing, but it's more like discovering. Swami Kriyananda's father was an oil geologist for Standard Oil Company, and he went and lived in Romania for a number of years. And oil in Romania was seeping out of the ground. It was just there, and people would scoop it up into little bowls, and they would make lamps out of it. It was always there, but then the Yuga began to shift, and people began to imagine that there were more subtle forms of energy. Oil is a more subtle form of energy than just pushing on things and trying to make them move. It's a fossil fuel. It's not as subtle as releasing the energy in an atom, for example. But it never occurred to anyone that there was energy in an atom and that you could release it until Einstein started his cycle, and then step by step, we've seen what can really happen. Now, the problem here with Dwapara Yuga and where we are, right now, is we are into Dwapara proper, but we're still in the very early stages, where we are experiencing the breakdown of a society that's based on matter. Now, the nature of matter is that things have fixed identities. These two things have fixed identities, isn't it? And I have a fixed identity, and you have one, and we might have some affinity, but the nature of matter is that everything seems separate from everything else. Thus, cultures, ethnicities, religions, countries, you're different than me, I don't like you because you're different than me, I am what I am, and we have no relationship to each other. But now, once you start getting into the age of energy, especially when Einstein's revelation and all that means, even literally, we are not different from each other. We are literally substances made of the same thing. And the more they investigate this, the harder and harder they have, the more and more difficult it's getting to define any point of fixed matter where things are actually different. The string theory, about which I know almost nothing, just says simply that it's energy all the way down, and there's just no way around it. So once we start moving into that reality, all these differences begin to dissolve. However, this is a terribly insecure time. And that's what we're seeing happening on our planet right now. It's like we used to be able to say, I'm Jewish, I'm Catholic, I'm Methodist, I'm American, I'm a New Zealander, and your children, married their own kind and stayed in their own country. And now people are just all over the world. We're not able to hold on to these fixed definitions. Now, for some people, this is exhilarating. This sudden awakening to this global unity, the nation of self-realization. We're one culture, we're one people. Everybody's dressing the same and speaking the same language and eating the same pizzas and just the whole thing, everywhere. When I left New Delhi the last time I was there, my farewell dinner in the city I was in Gurgaon, right outside of Delhi. I've been going to India for about 30 years, and 30 years ago this was unthinkable. But for my last dinner before I caught the airplane, I went to, and I kid you not, Fat Lulu's outside of Delhi, and had a really excellent Italian pizza before I got on the plane. It's like, where does all this come from? It comes from the fact that matter is dissolving, Energy is becoming the reality, and the energy allows us to unify. And this is the dissolution. Here is the dissolution of, in this age we dissolve space, and in this age the illusion of time begins to disappear. Okay? Mental power allows us to dissolve time. But now what I was saying about the insecurity of this is, it used to be that, society just stayed a certain way, and everyone had the comfort. This is how you behave, this is what you believe, this is who you are, this is the language you speak, and you could depend on your own kind to be like your own kind. You weren't invaded by others, all of these different things. And there is a certain security to that, isn't there? That you can predict, and it will always be like that. Once this begins to dissolve, what's happening to us right now is the fixed forms are dissolving, but the new forms have not yet emerged. And so what we have is an enormous amount of energy just bursting out, but not yet in a very coordinated way. And I haven't been in this country long enough to understand, sort of the dynamics of how your society is working. I've spent, of course, a lot of time in America. I've also been in India. And in India, it's a very, very interesting thing going on because it's a very ancient and an orthodox culture. And because of my life, my role in life, I have multi-generational friendships. So I have the confidence of many young Indians who are working in multinational corporations, who are traveling all over the world, who are discovering a social and moral standards that are entirely different than the ones that they were raised in. And then I talk to their parents, who tell me about all the things that they're going to have their children do and how they're going to behave. And I'm talking to the children, so to speak, young adults, about how they're not about to go along with what their parents have in mind, and I'm just watching this collision about to happen. It's the collision between matter and energy. In the age of matter, it's what you're doing externally that matters. You have to look right, you have to do the right thing. In the age of energy, it's the reality of your own consciousness, of who you actually are. That's why, interestingly, in the spiritual world, people are leaving their fixed definitions. Many people don't even believe in God, but they still call themselves spiritual. They do all these little polls in America. They love to do little polls in America. How many people go to church? How many people belong to a religion? And how many people call themselves spiritual? The people who call themselves spiritual just gets higher and higher, but the people who identify with any form gets lower and lower. You used to go to town and you would find the Methodist or the Presbyterian church. Now people look for a church that inspires them. And those who are attached to the Kali Yuga ideas bemoan the loss of denominational loyalty. That's how it was expressed. Those who are thinking in terms of energy and Dwapara are delighted to see that people are really moving, they're thinking for themselves, they're thinking in a new way. And on a much more profound level, what we see right now is this huge conflict, talking about what's going on in the Mideast, between this, this fanatical is the only word, determination that the form, our way, this form, these laws, this morality, this behavior, and they are frightened because they see that world collapsing around them. But the difficulty is, in a transition like this, the old does not usually go away without a fight. And many of the great masters, and actually anybody who reads the newspaper, you can see that an intense conflict is building between these two kinds of morality. Yogananda says that there will be a conflagration, and it's not only human-made, or let me phrase it differently, the dissonance of humanity is also affecting the planet. I know your country was profoundly affected by the earthquake in the South Island in Christchurch, which I haven't visited, but people have told me about. Yogananda says that all of these forces are interconnected, that the wildness, so to speak, of Dwapara Yuga allows people to direct energy in so many big directions with the internet and all of the technology that we have now. One individual can move a tremendous amount of energy, and you see all the wealth concentrating in certain hands and sides like that. But the dissonance in the moral and the spiritual side of things actually creates dissonance in the ether, in the planet. The disregard of Mother Nature as a living reality, the taking without giving back, the imbalance of overuse of resources and so on. That all of that is creating forces that are changing the weather, that are melting the icebergs, that are causing floods, causing outbreaks of diseases. All of these things, Yogananda says, are all part of this transition here, where the energy is freed but not yet balanced. And so the only answer to this is not, because impossible, a retreat backwards. You know, we can't give up the internet, the cell phone, the airplane, the globalization of the planet. People are trying to do that. I understand there's movements in this country. Keep all the rest of them out. You know, that's what's going on in our country too. Just keep all the rest of them out. Because we want to be able to define things in strict terms. The only way to go now is forward. Now, the good news is we are in an ascending cycle. And even though the transition is going to be rocky, and some of us may not live through it, we'll reincarnate here if it's a good idea, or not. But it's worthwhile in a cycle like this to put out dynamic positive energy, because that positive energy is registered in the ether and is really happening. When you live here, you know, where Jesus was, just before the end here, the disciples of Jesus was a fully self-realized master, and he came at that time to set a tone that would help take us through those very dark ages. But his disciples, immediately after he passed, they just went off, you know, they went off into the desert, they went off into monasteries. It was pointless to try to build anything in society, because it was all bad and getting worse and would all be destroyed. And their isolation actually kept a certain light of civilization alive. And karmically, of the planet, that was what they were guided to do. When Yogananda comes here to transition us between these two eras, his is to build a worldwide understanding of these teachings, and the essence of his message is individual spirituality, meditation, and the responsibility for our own consciousness in our own hands. Not priests, not rituals, not dogmas, not membership. The responsibility for our spirituality is in our own hands. It's our own inner reality, and that's the only reality that matters, because that's where we're going. Self-realization, what could be more completely personal and self-defined than that? And so this is a very positive time for making spiritual progress as a jiva, because for one thing, it's breaking open, and everybody can go in whatever direction they want to. And the second is, whoa, it's terribly insecure out there. So we really need to find our own inner strength, or we're going to get tumbled in a big way. Being tumbled is not so bad. Nobody lives forever. When a group of people who were really campaigning against nuclear war came to speak to Swami Kriyananda, and they had this fantastic presentation of, here's an American city, and when the nuclear bomb drops, this many hundreds of thousands will be instantly vaporized. All of these will turn to ash. These people will all die within, I mean, it was horrifying and true, completely true. And they wanted to scare everybody into doing something about it. Fear is a powerful motivator. So they wanted Swami Kriyananda to put his authority and our community behind it. Swami's responses was very interesting. First, he commended them on an excellent presentation and the sincerity of their efforts. Then he said, if you're trying to promote peace, fear is perhaps not the best tactic. Then the last thing he said was, 100 years from now, almost no one on the planet now will still be here. He said, whether we all go out together or whether we dribble off over the next century, he said, once you leave the physical plane and are in the astral world, it really makes no difference. In other words, our consciousness is the only responsibility we really have. And times like this help us. Help us because we can be in contact, we can see films and watch movies and see lectures and speeches of great souls anywhere in the world. For, any time in the last 100 years. You can see photographs of great masters. We have no photographs of Jesus, but we have photographs of Yogananda and Ramakrishna and all of these others. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times, but really it's simply the time we've chosen. And how it turns out for us is entirely in our hands. So, any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Now, what you're raising the question of is actually the whole essence of the discussion, and I completely understand what you're saying. Okay, you want to think that it's going somewhere. And this is the distinction between personal karma and personal evolution and the actual state of a planet. This happens to be the planet we're on now. This happens to be the cycle we're on now. But if we can accept the idea that there's many planets and many incarnated souls, absolutely it is going somewhere. But the it that's going somewhere is the individual's gradually expanding awareness until that awareness embraces infinity. The cultural and societal position is a physical reality of each planet in its own cycle. And if you or I or anyone needs to be in a Satya Yuga, we will find a planet that's having a Satya Yuga, right? But you see, even a great soul like Jesus came at the very nadir of this, and many great disciples came with him, because those were the right conditions for those individual souls to learn what they needed to learn. But that doesn't mean that their individual evolution is not progressive, but they acted out in different planetary conditions depending on what's exactly suitable for them. So from the point of view of Earth ever becoming a paradise, this is an extremely depressing story, because we'll just finally get it all together and then Atlantis will sink and we'll all go down again. And we'll build the pyramids about here, and then by this time we won't have the foggiest idea how they were built. There's an interesting reality here, which is that as you progress up this side, they begin to match. And so when we get to the point where we're at the pyramids, we'll be able to build them again. That's how it's described. But it'll be other souls, perhaps, or maybe you coming back to say, this is how we did it. That's sort of what Einstein did. He was just dropped in there and he just said, look, this is what's true. And he knew it at that point. And what happens on this side is, this is all in the Yugas book, which is so fascinating, is how all this power gradually becomes magic and then becomes black magic and gets darker and darker. There's fascinating stories about how it all descends. They remember that they used to be stronger than they are now. Think how many of the cultures that have been wiped out in the last few centuries, the American Indians, because of course that's the one I know the most, by the time the Europeans got there and decimated them pretty quickly, their own legend was that they were at the end of their cycle. And they all talked about the greatness of their people that was now over. And their own legends predicted that it was their civilization was finished. It was going to be replaced by something else. From our point of view, we think that's awful. From the point of view of the individuals whose callous disregard for their shared humanity, it was not good karma for them, but it was just what had to happen. And it gives you a certain calmness about a lot of other things that otherwise freak you out.